Welcome and opening remarks from our colleague Crispin d'Auvergne from the Paris Committee on Capacity Building. I have seen Crispin d'Auvergne online. So perhaps, yes, perfect. Welcome, Crispin.
Thanks very much, Juan. Greetings, everyone joining today. My name is Crispin d'Auvergne, and I am a member of the Paris Committee on Capacity Building, PCCB, representing the SIDS group on the committee. On behalf of the entire committee, I would like to welcome you all to the second session of the OECD PCCB Network Workshop Series on Capacity Development for Climate Action and Ambition. To set the context for our audience in terms of what the PCCB is, the committee was established at COP21 in 2015 with the mandate to address current and emerging gaps and needs in implementing and further enhancing capacity building in developing countries. The mission of the PCCB is to identify capacity gaps and needs and potential solutions, including enhancing the coherence and coordination of capacity building efforts related to climate change. To support the PCCB's mission, the committee therefore set up the PCCB Network in 2020 as a voluntary association of interested stakeholders engaged in climate-related capacity building, who can share information on good practices of their work, contribute to the work of the PCCB in fulfilling its mandate, and seek to connect with their peers across sectors and regions. Currently, we have over 280 members across 80 different countries, and there is always room for more. There is now a link in the chat for the audience to visit the webpage and consider joining the network. We hope you will. One of our recently joined and very active members is the OECD, with whom we are elated to be collaborating on this workshop series. The PCCB Network is a dynamic and member-driven network, and here we are at the second workshop in the series led by OECD and supported by Columbia Climate School's International Research Institute for Climate and Society. Agenda. Small island developing states, SIDS, are extremely vulnerable to hydrometeorological hazards. In fact, I can say that in St. Lucia, where I'm based, we had a tropical wave just yesterday, pretty early in the season. With the impact of climate change increasing this vulnerability, climate services and data play a key role in building resilience to extreme weather events and to adverse impacts of climate change. So from the SIDS perspective, I think this event and the discussions that it seeks to foster are very important. And I am personally very excited to follow the session. Without further ado, I would like to welcome you all to this session and to thank the OECD for leading this workshop with the support of IRI. And I see my friend John Furlow on. Finally, I would also like to request the audience to participate in the post-event survey, and you'll find the link in the chat, and provide us with feedback for this session. So with these few words, I welcome you, and I wish to say thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Crispin. And I would like now to pass the floor to Jens Sedemund. He's the head of the Environment Secretariat here at the OECD. He's going to be moderating the second session of today's workshop on lifting barriers to effective climate data and services in partner countries through capacity development. And so, Jens, over to you for the first panel.
Thank you very much, Juan. Can you hear me well? Great, thanks. So it's a real pleasure to be here, and I would like to welcome all the participants to this session and also our panelists. I think we have a great panel, and we're going to focus on lifting barriers to climate data and services through capacity development and harnessing that data basically in identifying and delivering climate action and results. Now, as I said, our panelists have a very important insights on this topic, and it's actually a topic also that has focused the attention of donors for quite some time. Now, I think it's, we've heard it before just from Crispin, but just to, frame briefly the session, I think it's evident that climate-related data is a really key to enhance resilience, but also I think equally for the mitigation, because basically, you know, if you think about climate change, it alters the world around us. And basically, to take effective action, we need to understand, we need to have information and data of what that change is looking like. So information is a fundamental basis of well-informed decision-making and therefore, you know, effective policy. And not just that, it's also actually essential to investment decisions, both in terms of understanding, you know, which investments are climate proof, or how to best climate proof them, or how to make them actually investable based on the data that we have. Now, research also shows very clearly that climate data and services, when readily available, contribute to outcomes that are better from a development point of view, with fewer economic losses, more investment to sectors, and lower impacts on livelihoods and exposure to climate-related hazards. So with this session, we aim to shed a bit of light on how donors and other stakeholders are working in this area. And the panel is going to help us on this decision around 3 topics. What is the big picture in terms of the challenges and gaps when it comes to the information and data services? What is good practice and positive examples that we can observe from country or donor activities? And what kind of recommendations could be made to donors who are, you know, interesting and I think maybe are aware that more needs to happen or something better needs to happen in this area? So with that, I would like to turn to our panelists. Thank you very much again for having joined us. And we're planning to have 2 rounds intervention, 1 question or, you know, 1 round each for 1 question. And we'll take a bit of time after each round to see if there are any questions or answers from the audience or comments before we go into the next one. But let me start with our first panelist, Mr. John Furlow, Director, International Research Institute for Climate and Security at Columbia Climate School. And the question that I would like to ask you is, what do you see as the main capacity barriers that developing countries face today to develop climate services? And maybe also a bit focus on the specificity of the climate information there as relating to overall information. So please, the floor is yours, John.
Sure. Thank you, Jens, and thanks to the OECD and the PCCB, and thanks, Crispin. It's good to see you as well. So I think as Jens was saying, adaptation is a multidisciplinary challenge, particularly for developing countries, but if you want to support the major economic sectors and economic growth in countries, you need to think about the multiple sectors that play together. Agriculture is not just food production, it requires water, it requires energy, it requires transportation and labor. And then there's the climate information that comes in, or the weather that comes in and complicates things. So when you think about a climate service, you need to think about not just the production of the data, but think of it as a value chain. You want to have somebody, usually the meteorological service, produce good, useful data in a time frame that is useful for decision makers. But you also want to translate it so that the decision makers that need it can understand it. A farmer will think about weather and climate information differently than an energy manager or a transportation manager. And then you want to make sure that it reaches them. So you want to use a medium of communication for the data or for the information that will reach the users. And then ideally, you want to get it embedded in standard practice. So you want to make sure that the decision maker, whether it's a smallholder farmer or a ministry or whatever, has the knowledge and the resources to do something differently if the information suggests that they should. You don't want a farmer to always only have the option of doing the same thing, whether it's a wet year or a dry year. So some of the barriers are that meteorological agencies who are responsible for climate information are almost never a terribly powerful agency in a national government, whether it's the United States or Burkina Faso, pick a small country. And often they have weak relations with the organizations and agencies that need to use the information. I've been in countries where the Ministry of Agriculture and others were not fully aware that there was a meteorological service that they could be depending on. So if the powerful ministries that are responsible for economic growth don't recognize the role of the weather and the climate in their own success and don't understand that they could go to a Met service and get support it's unlikely to happen, which is going to keep the Met Service weak. Then on practical matters, this producing weather and climate forecasts, maintaining the data is pretty technical stuff. It's not cheap. It requires people. It requires a lot of equipment. Maintaining weather stations, installing them is one thing. Keeping them working and gathering the data is hard. And then again, we're talking about agencies that are usually underfunded and understaffed. But the demand for services is growing, so this puts more pressure on the meteorological service. And then the capacity support comes in disorganized ways. I used to be with USAID, and we would do a training, and then we would hear from a meteorological service that, oh, GIZ was here a few weeks ago, and they did almost the same training. Well, why didn't you tell us? So the developing country Met agency doesn't want to say, oh, thanks USAID, but we do not want your help. We just got it. We need to work with them to talk about what they need and what they want and make sure that support aligns with need and doesn't overlap with things they've already had, and that we're looking at gaps that could be filled. So I guess I will stop there and come back in a later round or answer any questions, but thank you.
Many thanks, John. And I think that was a really great start of the understanding that, the three elements of data generation, interpretation, and then getting it to users. I guess the challenge of meteorological agencies not being the most powerful political agencies, I think, and I think at the end, a very important point to me where, which essentially came down to the question of, how to make sure that the resources available can be coordinated and not fragmented so that they have the most useful impact. But with that, let me turn to our next panelist, Ms. Kathy Kruger from Paris 21, the Partnership in Statistics for the 21st Century, which was established just as the turn of the millennium by different international organizations, including the OECD, where it's housed. And Kathy is an inter-regional advisor. And the question to you, Kathy, is, I think you work a lot directly with developing countries to develop, statistical systems and capacity there and data capacity. And what, based on your experience, are the main bottlenecks in developing countries to gather and use climate data?
Great, thank you, Jens, and good afternoon, everybody. Actually, the area of climate change data is a new one for Paris 21. And I think for me, that's symbolic of the overall situation with capacity development for climate change data. Traditionally, we see previously a lot of support has been given to health data, poverty analysis, and in the last 5 or 10 years or so, we've seen increased support for economic data and gender statistics, for example. But only now are we seeing more and more attention being given to data for monitoring, reporting, analyzing changes in climate. And this, as John also pointed out, is a very serious problem, considering that climate change data is crucial, not only to help countries with the international reporting, of course, but also to inform mitigation and adaptation actions nationally. But as with any new area of development, there are a number of challenges to overcome. And this is particularly apparent for climate change data due to the multiple dimensions of climate change, social, economic, and environmental, and the complexity of the issue. There's a lot of debate at the moment on what we actually mean by climate change data, but I think everyone is pretty much agreed that we're not only talking about traditional survey data. John mentioned other types of data, a wider variety of sources, everything from data from weather stations, as he mentioned, administrative data from ministries, monitoring systems, data from energy and waste companies. But how these data can be accessed and how they can work together presents enormous challenges for countries with low capacity and low resources. Indeed, they also present challenges for countries with high capacity and high resources. So, we're not only talking about developing countries here. The first bottleneck relates then to this wide diversity of data and actors in terms of coordinating the system. In most countries, the National Statistical Office has a mandate to coordinate the statistical system, but for climate change data, coordination needs to move outside of this traditional system. New actors need to be coordinated, different government ministries, civil society organizations, even private companies in many cases. Paris 21, as you said, supports many countries in developing national strategies for statistics, and coordination among government actors is always a key challenge. But coordination then among all these other actors is very difficult for most NSOs today. In 2021, we helped Zambia, for example, to carry out a stakeholder mapping for environment statistics. The main result from this initiative was to get actors to speak to each other and simply to know who they needed to speak to. Another challenge is on a more technical level, how to integrate the diverse types of data, often with different methodologies, different definitions, and sometimes where metadata or information about the data themselves are lacking. Most countries are still struggling with how to use administrative data in conjunction with survey data. What are the quality issues with admin data? How can we relate these data to each other? But if we're then talking about other kinds of data, data from local government, of monitoring water use, data from mobile phone operators tracking populations, data from weather stations to monitor temperature rises, these issues become even more complex. In Kenya, for example, we've been working with the NSO to develop a structured approach to addressing the quality of citizen-generated data. This is to use it to produce statistics at subnational level. This could be very interesting for climate change, but this is still in its infancy in development. So these new sources notwithstanding, even government data is still not shared within and even between ministries. So there's a lack of clear roles regarding the kind of data management, data stewardship. So in terms of legal basis, the NSO or another actor needs to have a strong mandate to access data from government ministries. As John pointed out, these are often quite weak institutions. So we really need to have stronger statistical legislation, to ensure that exceptions for use for statistical purposes, the data that can be used in a coherent way. So there are some legal bottlenecks to this as well. Privacy restrictions, for example, which are quite rightly often very strong, but need to be adapted to allow use for statistics. Finally, and not least, existing funding for data-driven climate action together with human resources required are very limited. Many developing countries are adopting climate strategies, but there is often still a lack of a specific reference to data, or even they don't even include clear indicators or targets to be monitored. This was the case when we recently helped St. Vincent and Grenadines to begin their process for a new strategy for statistics. Low capacity countries often rely on limited external project-based funding to develop climate change data rather than having it integrated into core budgets. But this makes it short-term and unsustainable. So if NSOs are going to be able to recruit staff to actually work in this sector, then they need to move from this project-based financing to more strategic and long-term model, which benefits and assures a sustained development of national capacities. Paris 21 believes that that a systems approach is necessary to address some of these challenges based on current indicator frameworks produced by the UN Statistics Division and even the UNFCCC. We need to help countries to map the systems, to identify actors and data holders, and then one by one to find ways to overcome these obstacles, to getting the data, whether they need to revise legislation, develop capacity in data science and data integration, or develop coordination and collaboration structures. So we've been developing a system for data ecosystems to help countries to understand their climate change data systems. So we hope to test this approach more in countries by the end of the year. And this meeting has really come a very timely point for us. Thank you.
Many thanks, Kathy. A wealth of very interesting points, I think very complementary. I mean, just to recap some of the points that stuck with me. One is that climate data is sort of relatively new for Paris 21, but rapidly growing in importance, I guess. And again, I think you refer to the key challenge of coordination, and I think integrated approaches, systems approaches. I think you also became very clear that you refer to a wealth of data and data potential that is can be generated, can be produced. Sometimes the question for me, and maybe we can come back to that, is also, what is the key data that you need? Because I think data can also be overwhelming sometimes, I guess, in terms of the potential and the amount. Then one thing that I also found interesting, where you said, it's actually the challenge is with regard to data capacity. It's quite common, not just developing countries, but also high-income countries who have more resource to provide for their capacity. And actually, the point that you said, human resources are key. It's not so much just getting the training, but it's sort of the feet on the ground, the people on the ground, sort of, who can actually deal with the data. And sort of if you have fundamental capacity constraints in terms of the people that you have, I guess you have a fundamental constraint in the absorptive capacity for, I think you can take on a lot of information, but acting and implementing that is very difficult. And then again, I think the need to move away from project-based approaches. So very, very interesting points to me. So with that, now let me move to, I think, one organization that is very much central in the data space for climate, and invite Mr. Amir Deliu, and I hope that is semi-well pronounced, to come in. And Amir is the Senior Scientific Officer in Climate Services branch of the World Meteorological Organization, where I understand your main task is actually relating to capacity development and provision of climate science and knowledge, and also coordination of WMO's contribution to UNFCCC. And so the question is, what kind of challenges have you identified in that position in this area, and how do you see that these challenges can best be addressed and lifted? Amir, please.
Thank you, Jens, and hello to all participants. Let me please confirm very closely I shared the ideas raised by John and Kathy, how similar they are to our experience in WMO, because we are dealing with national meteorological and hydrological services. WMO has 193 member states, and more than 55 of them are among least developed countries. So in the whole value cycle of the provision of climate services, from data to information to exchange and utilization of the information for better decision making, we have always faced a lot of challenges. In terms of infrastructural issues, climate data management system, data rescue, and digitized data is a big challenge which has not been existing. We are trying to improve the quality of data to bring them into a digitized format to be used by the whole world to help those countries. Then in terms of institutional aspect, there has not been a kind of unified governance around the world over data and databases. These climate databases are national assets, and each country has its own regulations. But in 2021, WMO introduced a unified data policy resolution in our Congress. We are encouraging countries to implement that unified policy to facilitate the exchange of data with other stakeholders, with other ministries, even beyond their borders, with neighboring countries who have the same climatic patterns, to have the same vulnerability over their sectors. On procedural issues, compliance with technical regulations is a big challenge. If the data is not standardized, if the methodologies and tools are not standardized, they produce orange and apple. You cannot really compare the products and information to bring or to produce a bigger picture to characterize the climate system. So we are trying to implement quality management system, which is a comprehensive process approach to ensure that from data to information to competency of the technical staff members and to exchange policy, everything is standardized around the world, and all countries apply the same system. In terms of human resources, we have also the same challenge, particularly in developing countries and LDCs. We have put our focus on competency-based training to quickly teach the skills, innovative tools and methods by our partner institutions who provide these methodologies, by academia and universities, to really bring at the shortest time in a most efficient way the best help. Kathy mentioned the socioeconomic data, which is, even to my understanding, a bigger challenge, because at least for climate data, we have a defined standard, an international organization advising how to manage it, how to save it, by which tools and methods analyze, and what are the products. But when it comes to socioeconomic data, which in our methodology, we call it non-climatic contributing factors, first of all, there is no unified database in the world. They are totally different from one sector to another. Methodologies are not universal. There is still big debate in scientific community. What is the best method? How each method and tool complement each other, and what are the best correlations we can establish to interpret the impacts for best solution. Another challenge that we have also faced is finance. Finance has very scarcely supported science. Now, after COP26 in Glasgow, there is a new dialogue. They call it Global Goal on Finance. We are trying now to establish this dialogue with finance and investment community to tell them, listen, everything starts with data, and that's science which adds value to data analysis and products. Science should support. For every single dollar that finance supports, they will get 4 to 10 times more benefit. So these are our challenges. Yeah. Thank you.
Many thanks, Amir, and yeah, I think again a very, very interesting point. I mean, first you I think confirmed what we had heard from the previous panelists, and I think then focused on issues like data sharing, because I guess, you know, once the marginal cost of data once produced is pretty much zero. Then I think you highlighted very convincingly the point of data standards, and that's also, I guess, essential, not least for the sharing, the standardization to ensure that data can be understood in the same way across, you know, across all the users. And interestingly, you said on the climate data itself, there's good, I mean, progress there, at least in terms of having defined standards, also how to manage and save it. But then the bigger challenge relates to the socioeconomic data, where there are no universal methodologies. And if, last but not least, again, the question on finance or funding. And I think that's very interesting because, as you said, you know, there's a potential huge return on investment here. And as we've heard in many ways also that it's a key, I think the sound data is a key condition for reducing risk and having more certainty for investment. So it is very much also the flip side that the investors are looking for the data to you know, basically assure the bankability or test the bankability of what they may or may not be doing then. So great, thanks a lot for these points. And with that, let's move on to our fourth panelist, Ms. Georgina Campbell-Fletter. And Georgina is Executive Director of Tomorrow Now, which is a non-profit that is working to accelerate the adoption of advanced weather and climate innovations in the regions most in need, basically. And with her team, Georgina is bringing the latest weather and space intelligence to community level, and works across the public, private, and NGO sectors to you know, ensure that everyone can really adapt and thrive in their climate as it is changing. So, Georgina, how, based on your experience in working on the ground, also, how can effective capacity to gather and use climate data and to develop climate services help marginalized communities adapt to climate change?
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. So yeah, thanks for the opportunity to contribute to this dialogue. And you know, I think as a non-profit with Tomorrow Now, you know, we have our ear to the ground and are very much working at this kind of community level and kind of trying to lift the voice of frontline communities, and increasingly so actually the public Met offices as well across emerging markets. So hopefully we can kind of bring a slightly different or kind of unique perspective to this conversation. And the question that you pose, I really like, actually, because it's kind of a a what if question, right? It's like a what if we get this right? You know, the improvements that John mentioned that we need to bring across the hydromet value chain, or the data standardization goals that Amir talked about. What if we can get this right, and we can get climate and weather data and tools into the hands of the poorest communities in the world? How much of a difference can we make? And I've got a few, I guess, a couple of stories that I want to share that will kind of, I guess, help us kind of bring this back down to kind of a community level, and not just for motivation, but I also think that, you know, really understanding the benefits and the value that it can bring community can kind of help guide the product market fit or solution kind of user fit. So at Tomorrow Now, we kind of think about this technology impact fit through two lenses, crisis and opportunity. And we're kind of more focused on the kind of short-term weather data versus the kind of long-term climate data. But, you know, I think all the same, it's kind of a helpful perspective. So in the context of crisis, you know, we're asking questions like, how can we respond faster and more efficiently to crisis, whether it's cyclones or droughts or flash floods? You know, we often are in a conversation with Red Cross teams on the ground in East Africa, and they're asking the question, how can we respond faster and more efficiently to flash floods? How can the World Food Programme distribute food aid more efficiently in advance of an extreme drought? You know, how can the International Rescue Committee move people to safety before a cyclone? And, you know, I know that these are kind of, I guess, likely familiar to the group here, but, you know, the reality is it can take 6 to 12 months to raise the funds, distribute the aid that is necessary to respond to a disaster today. And the opportunity behind what we're talking about can really drive progress there. And then there's the opportunity, so crisis and opportunity. And I think it's important to look at this differently. So through a different lens, how can we create more opportunity for farmers, for local businesses, for the renewables industry, for the agricultural supply chain in the context of a changing climate? And, you know, again, I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but the climate is really changing in front of our eyes. And those who are most impacted and most at risk of climate change are the least equipped to adapt and thrive. And we need to give people the data to both adapt and thrive on a daily basis, as well as kind of reduce their risk, and, you know, farmers to boost their yields, and not just kind of mitigate the kind of 1 in 5, 10 year kind of crisis, even though these events are becoming more frequent. And clearly on both crisis and opportunity, there's huge impact that we can drive through these new kind of climate and weather services. And on crisis, you know, there's an Oxfam report that you may or may not have seen that's kind of creating a bit of a stir at present, because the data is suggesting that climate change is really breaking the humanitarian aid model today. Some of the statistics that they highlight are around, you know, extreme weather appeal requirements are now 800% higher than 20 years ago. And that only 7.5% of extreme weather disasters have been covered by UN appeals in low and middle income countries over that 20-year period. And even in the last 5 years, there's been a $33 billion funding shortfall for extreme weather appeals. And, you know, the good news is that humanitarian agencies are really shifting to this kind of proactive anticipatory action kind of perspective, where they're trying to get ahead of disaster and trigger funding before the event and pre-positioning emergency response crews. But ultimately, we need to drive these new innovations in order to unlock the potential, the true potential of the humanitarian sector. And then opportunity, I wanted to share a couple of quick stories from the field. We recently, my team and I just returned from Kenya, where we visited a government call center that's supporting, that we're actually supporting right now with timely localized weather. And there were several people in the office taking calls as we were there from local farmers, and they get about 200 calls a day at the moment. And we were there just right in the middle of the rainy season. And the two most common questions that are coming through this call center, and we're all familiar with them, those who are kind of working in the kind of agriculture sector, it's what's the weather for tomorrow and what should I plant? And why are they asking these questions? Because they want to grow and feed, they want to grow crops and feed their families nutritious foods. They want high germination rates, they want high yields. They don't want to have to replant, sometimes because they can't afford it. And we're getting better and better at helping answer those questions today, but there's still a lot of work to do. And what we're talking about today and these solutions are a critical part of enabling us to get the right information to these farmers and to empower them through this data. And on the same trip, I met a farmer called Leia. She was a phenomenal woman, works full-time at a manufacturing facility, also grows nutritious vegetables for her young children in about 1/4 of an acre that she has access to, which provides about 60% of the food for her family. And then she has another 1/4 of an acre where she grows chilies, which she then dries and sells to the local market to make money to cover fees for her kids' school. Now, she was telling me that her chilies had been wiped out by a flash flood 2 years in a row, and she's not growing chilies this year. And I asked her, or we asked her, how could we, could you have prevented that flood? Could you have prevented the damage? And she said, yes, I could have dug trenches to help the water kind of run off. And, we then responded, well, why didn't you do that? Why didn't you dig the trenches? And she said, well, I didn't have a timely warning. And if I had known with some level of certainty, just some level of certainty, that there would have been heavy rains that week, I could have justified paying other local farmers to help me dig the trenches. And I'm telling you this story because I'm trying to kind of drive home this point that unreliable forecasts are preventing farmers from thriving and achieving opportunity in Kenya and beyond. So I think what we're doing here in this conversation is absolutely critical, and we have to be intentional about reaching those who are most at risk but least equipped right now with this kind of weather and climate data that we're trying to drive forward.
Many thanks, Georgina. And again, just a few things that I picked up. I think the question of how to really make sure that the data and the information gets to those who most need it. So the poorest. I think the focus on crisis on opportunity, both very relevant. The ability to act faster, to respond. And I think one thing that I always come back is just the point I think that came out in what you just said now is that the information clearly is related to the climate challenge, but it's just useful for development per se, and I think it goes back to a point that we found in our research on supporting climate action, where we say basically sound climate policy is just sound development policy and vice versa. I mean, it's very hard. I mean, it's increasing yields, etc. All the same objectives that development policy overall had, which are very much at the core here. So thanks a lot for that. We've gone through the first round of questions. Let me see now, maybe if there's some reactions or questions from the audience before we go into a quick second session. So for those who would like to come in now from the broader group, please raise your hand so that we can call upon you. Yes, and we have a first hand, and also just say that's Amir, and obviously it's great also to have the panelists reacting to each other. So Amir, please.
So apology, I'm not among the audience, but thanks for very nice practical discussion and transferring observation from local experience that Georgina shared with us. Actually, adaptation starts with early warning system. There is no argument about that, but it covers the whole time scale. It is not just weather phenomena. We should also be prepared for seasonal and intra-seasonal phenomena like drought, sea level rise, and those things. But my argument is that even if scientific community provides that information to local community, that is not enough. The local community should be trained how to react by each sector specific expert. So agricultural community, those experts have another mandate to complement climate scientists' data and information, to teach the local farmers what to plant, how to react before flash flood and all those things. But everybody is building expectation over climate information. But the other cycle, the other half is how to react. They should also be trained and learn about that. They should be provided with those facilities.
Many thanks, Samir, for this point. And I guess the importance of saying, look, I think it goes back to the point of how do you use the data and bring it into sort of the respective areas that are affected and that need to change. And we have one further hand up from Melody Brown. Please, Melody.
Thanks. Yeah, I really appreciate the discussion so far. I just wanted to add on to a few points that were made. So first of all, yeah, I fully agree with what Amir just said and the fact that farmers and communities also need to be trained. And I think one of the aspects that, in my experience, is often not well understood is the uncertainty around forecasts. And so if a forecast tells you that, you know, there's a 40% chance of, I don't know, heavy rainfall, and then there's no heavy rainfall, it doesn't mean that the forecast is wrong. You're still it's a 40-60 ratio, right? So if it tells you there's 40% chance of something happening, if it doesn't happen, then, or if it happens, you know, it's just a ratio. So I think teaching probabilities to people when we talk about forecasts and teaching people, helping people better understand uncertainty is something that's really important. And I just also wanted to to add to another thing that Amir said about the non-climatic contributing factors. And I think that's something that we face a lot in the kind of work that we do with IRI. And so, for example, I've worked a lot in Bangladesh, and you know, we've talked with decision makers about how to better include climate information in their decisions. And very often, to really develop anticipatory mechanisms, or, you know, we've worked on index insurance and a number of strategies, you need to be able to look at climate information, but also impact data. And in Bangladesh, for example, it's really, really difficult to find impact data. So for example, when there's a flood, what are the actual consequences of the flood? Like, how do we know how many people were affected, how much were the crops affected, how many roads, etc. When we work on index insurance, we look at past information and how much different types of data sets are able to capture what happened in reality. But if we don't have data that's showing us what happened in reality, we don't have anything to compare the climate data with. So it's definitely a matter of having good climate data, but also having good socioeconomic data to compare it with. And very often on the decision maker side, we're told that there's no climate data, but they don't necessarily understand the importance of all these other types of data, like socioeconomic data.
Many thanks, Melody. And I think very relevant. I guess, fundamentally to me, it goes back to the question of saying, well, data, obviously data is important in climate, but data is also more important for development overall. And there are sort of interlinkages between how to use the ones and draw the conclusions and come up with better responses. And maybe let me now go to the second round where we have to be a bit faster, but also let me point to some of the questions that we were asked in the chat. And there's a reference to saying, adaptation is clearly broader than early warning systems. It's not just that, which I don't think was the intention, but maybe, that's something that also panelists can respond to. Questions around, how to see open data and open source technology and helping with effective use of data, and maybe some examples there. And then a specific question also to Amir on the importance of data for financial stakeholders and investments, and any comments on this potentially. I mean, there are more questions there. I'm just picking some to not, I think, make it too heavy, but obviously Amir can come in on different aspects of the question as well. But with that, let me go into the second round of the comments, and maybe since the question was to Amir, let me start with you, and also from my side at maybe another option for you to answer, and that's around the question, whether you have encountered solutions for capacity development that you see are particularly effective or could be replicated or scaled up to ensure that climate action is accelerated in developing countries. So a wealth of questions to you, and just a few minutes to answer them.
Yeah, actually working with finance, I give you a practical example. Since late 2018, we have started working with the Green Climate Fund. They approached us asking for evidence in project proposals to show scientific evidence and data, how the project can prove the vulnerability and how much is it intense and how frequently they happen. And that really started a big project with them. We call it Climate Science Information for Climate Action, or in brief, Climate Rational. We have published the methodology and submitted last year to COP26 as a supplement for National Adaptation Plan. I don't go into details. It has 4 steps, but it explains how to extract valuable quality control data, how to analyze by which methodologies, where are the sources, scientific community, and what are the relevant socioeconomic data that can complement it. And the whole methodology was so satisfactory to the Green Climate Fund that their independent technical advisory panel, ITAP, has chosen that to evaluate all project proposals that are submitted to GCF. And their board meeting this week, or I think next week, will meet board 33. Hopefully we'll approve the methodology. So this is an example that we have been working with finance community really to bring science and the value of climate data and information into the context of their work, then to bring them closer to scientific community to work together. They support us and we validate their project proposals. I will put the link on the methodology. We have published it. It is available online. One of the annexes of the methodology is the most complete inventory of all tools and methods in the world currently, which are being used. So with links, everything. We will also organize a forum, IRI and OECD, other colleagues will be invited late September. We put together all methodologies on the table. We compare, find the overlaps, complementarity, and gaps, more importantly, even limitations, to advise the stakeholders and practitioners which method is the best for your region, for which sector. I will put that link in the chat.
Great, many thanks, Samir. That's fantastic, and that sounds like an extremely rich and important resource. And with that, let me turn over to John again with sort of a question from my side, but then also, the opportunity to maybe respond to some of the other points that were raised in the chat and the questions. And that's, how you think donor support can best help partner countries to access, develop, and use climate services. And I think it's particularly interesting to know that you used to work with USAID, so you have a very direct experience and sense of how donors operate. So with that, over to you, John.
Sure, thank you. So let me start by saying the IRI was created by NOAA, the U.S. National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, about 25 years ago, to dig into this question of not only how do we produce useful forecasts, but how do we make sure people are able to use them for better decision making? And the way we work now is through a capacity building model where we train national weather services in developing countries to produce good forecasts. We do that in collaboration with the WMO. And we focus on seasonal forecasts, and we're increasingly focusing on sub-seasonal. So to comment on Georgina's comment that, you need to get people useful information, and often that's what's going to happen the next day or the next week, for them to plan in advance. Then they need a little bit longer. And so we find the seasonal forecast to be quite useful. And we find that empowering the national agency to do this for themselves rather than us delivering the data is very useful. And then I think that, I'll come back to the role of private and other organizations. And then we also work increasingly, and I think this is to get into what donors can do, we work increasingly to help developing countries understand their interest is in continued positive development, socioeconomic development. Climate is not a sector, it's a disruptor of that climate variability and change. So in order to achieve their development goals, they need to understand how climate is undermining that. So we don't want to treat it as a separate sector. So one of the things that the donor community can do is, as you said, Jens, continue to bring together the climate concerns with the development ambitions and help understand where climate risk is really undermining development outcomes, and then support them to provide the information and the tools and the training that is needed so they can identify the risks and alleviate those risks. I think it's important for the donors to respect the systems that countries have put in place for themselves and then build up those systems. So work with the meteorological agency. I know there's been a lot of talk that, well, the Mets are weak, so let's go to the private sector. The private sector is not as likely to have the mandate to support the poorest of the poor. The Met Service, the government is most likely to have that mandate. So let's think about how the private sector and the public sector can work together to produce good information. And then, as Tomorrow Now is doing, get it to people so they can use it. But let's think about strengths and roles and responsibilities. And then last, recognize the systems that the world, that the WMO has put in place and work through those. We've seen some donors starting to work through other agencies, other systems, rather than national METs and the network that the WMO has developed. I think we want to build that up. As Amir was saying, the WMO has responsibility for building up these services in support of economic development. So if you're working through a space agency or only with a data agency or an ag ministry or something, you may be undermining, in the long term, undermining the positive outcome that linking all of these different things together in a system or a value chain is supposed to have. I think the donors, the convening power of a donor can help build relationships between the producers of information, the users of information, and then start bringing in NGOs in the private sector to identify how they can fill gaps in the capacities of the works that are, of the organizations that are responsible for these things. And then I think most important, we're going to hear more from Jackie Spence from Jamaica in the SID session. Follow up. This is not a one-off thing. This is complicated stuff. So if you support and there's a little bit of progress, go back and make sure that it's really sticking and help people follow through and continue to grow their skills and their capacities and the support that they can offer. And I'll stop there.
Many thanks, John. Great points again. And again, just a few things that stuck with me. One, I mean, the point that climate is not a sector, it's a disruptor. And I think, also the fascinating point that to me is not yet sort of sufficiently present, that you say, well, adaptation is basically for development. You adapt to something, but what you adapt for, you adapt to be able to develop and continue to develop. And that's actually how adaptation and the adaptation objective is defined in the Paris Agreement. Then I think, the point about respecting country systems, focusing on building up the country systems and the capacities, avoiding parallel system fragmentation, all of that, I think it just goes very much to the core of what is considered to be effective development cooperation. So again, I think it resonates. It's great to see the messages come up and see their relevance also in this space again. And yeah, I think it's something that all the donors pretty much have subscribed to. So let's see how we what a good way is to get them to act on that. But let me now turn to Kathy also with again the option to choose from the questions that were posed, plus an additional from my side, which is what you see as the entry points for the donor community in the area of climate data and capacity development. So Kathy, over to you.
Great, thank you. No, just to pick up a question that came in the chat about the open data, and I think, I mean, what's really key is to understand why we need that, why we're asking for the data. If you're going to get access to data, especially I think from private companies, as we've been discussing, because if they're worried that it's going to be used for taxation purposes or for monitoring or for marketing, I think somebody wrote, then I think it's not going to happen. We have to build this trust that we're using the reason that we need the data is to produce the kind of reliable decisions and policies and so on. So I think that's a really good point, and something that we all need to work on, I think, when talking about data and reaching out to different parties and so on. In terms of how the donor community should act, I mean, we've heard a lot about the coordination perspective, and I spoke about coordination among national actors. And I think it's also key that the donor community is being coherent, has a coherent approach towards climate change data. I think in his previous intervention, John mentioned that they came and someone had already been and they were doing the same thing. And so how do we build this kind of knowledge about what's going on in countries in this kind of data landscape, which is very fragmented? I mean, our recommendation is that we need to make an effort before going into countries to identify the most pressing national needs, what other development partners are doing, and look for synergies that can benefit the countries rather than just looking in at your own specific project. Paris 21 has a few initiatives. We have this report on partner support to statistics press. We also have a recent platform called the Clearinghouse for Development Data, which is trying to enhance coordination within the donor community, just specifically with regard to projects towards data. We hope to develop a kind of special channel looking at climate change data to see, to try to build, identify funding opportunities for countries, but also look and see what projects are in existence and advocate also for more support to data and statistics in this area. So I'll put the link in the chat so people can go in and have a look at that. As I said, as yet, we don't have a climate change data channel there, but the idea is that we hope to build that. I think, in terms of empowering countries to address climate change risks through these kind of evidence-based policies, this is something which is at the core of the climate change data ecosystem approach that I was mentioning. I mean, we've seen that support to improve reporting to global agendas by development of frameworks and standards and initiatives and so on we need to mobilize the national actors. Is particularly in low capacity countries and those at the front line of the risks, as we heard, they need more strategic financing to enhance national policies. In particular, as I mentioned before, including data development in national climate strategies, ensuring that there are clear measurable indicators in national policies and strategies. This would actually help to advocate for more resources from national budgets and not only from donor funding, but to complement the donor funding. And this is to ensure that that we get kind of sustainable and long-term development of climate-related data. So that's really two areas that I think we can work on, and not only the data approach, but also looking more at the policies and the strategies that are in existence in order to make sure that data is an integral part of that, of those processes as well. Thank you.
Many thanks, Kathy. And yeah, I think again, a couple of key points. I think what's coming back is the importance of coordination, first at the national level. Then I think the donor coordination, to have a coherent approach to be collectively, I guess, effective and avoid sort of further fragmentation of the landscape, and focusing on the most pressing needs. You mentioned some platforms that you're building for basically enhancing donor coordination around the support for data. And again, the point coming out of empowering countries basically, and there, I think also specific point on the strategic and targeted financing to anchor data, focus more in national strategies for development and I guess for climate more broadly, and having an integrated approach. So thanks a lot for these points. And then finally, let me turn to again to Georgina. And I think you got a couple of comments that you can respond to or may want to respond to as well. But beyond that, again, one additional question also from my side, and that is how do you achieve a weather-informed and climate-resilient world in developing countries? It's no small task, I guess, no small order question. And also, if you have some positive experience on this that you could share to inspire others, I think that would be great. So with that, over to you, Georgina.
Great. Yeah, it clearly is the holy grail question, right? And I think we're all motivated on this call and to kind of address and answer that, and we're all kind of playing our part in that mission. If I don't address specifically the kind of questions that are from me in the chat, maybe we can kind of bring it up in the discussion. But so like I said, can't address all. That is kind of a question that I could speak to for the rest of the day. But I'll highlight a few kind of insights that I think might be relevant to this audience. So first, I did want to kind of double down and stress the importance of weather in the climate conversation. And I think that, and I bring it up, and maybe I'm again preaching to the choir a little bit, and I do think that kind of the seasonal and sub-seasonal are critical, and kind of the longer term climate data and insights that come from that are very important, in fact, very important for planning purposes. But the localized decision-making and kind of action that's triggered at a local level it tends to be based on weekly and daily information. And I feel like we know that it hasn't received as much attention, and it's kind of a missing piece in the kind of climate adaptation story. And at Tomorrow Now, we are working hard to, with other organizations, many represented on this call, to kind of amplify this message, both at a systems level and a local level. And we're finding that, we are kind of gaining traction. We are accelerating funds and solutions and different stakeholders and progress towards this kind of cause, because I think the kind of collective action is, or the collective goal, I guess, is climate action, but the kind of critical infrastructure layer that fuels climate action is weather. And it requires significant attention in every developing country on the planet. And, again, among scientists, meteorologists, this community, it might seem a really obvious point, but it really isn't being prioritized by many donors in the space who fund climate adaptation, because they don't necessarily see the link. And also at a country and national level, because budgets for national Met services at a country level are being cut across, for example, across the continent of Africa, because the value often is not really understood or being realized at a local level, and partially because it's kind of a chicken and an egg. Until you invest in the system and improve the system, you're not really going to see that kind of value. And I think also the point that Melody brought up around the understanding uncertainty and kind of, the reliability of a weather forecast that you get a day out is going to be different from the sub-seasonal, seasonal forecasts that you get at different timeframes. So, I think this is one of the kind of key issues that we're trying to address through Tomorrow Now, and to kind of focus funders, climate innovators, and kind of on this kind of weather as a system, and bringing organizations around this kind of common purpose. Another point that I wanted to make is, again, perhaps obvious, but I think it's important to say out loud that we must and can work better together. And, we'll hear actually later on in the Tomorrow Now lightning session led by my colleague Ronald. But, the key is that we can leverage new partnerships, especially with the private sector, but of course, with the academia and the public sector, humanitarian sectors, to kind of bring out the best that everyone has to offer. And, I guess I'm re-emphasizing John's point here that, it is about understanding the unique value and the strengths of these different stakeholders, and then figuring out how we can work better together. And you can kind of only do that by learning by doing, and just doing it through projects. But I think it's an important kind of point. And then I guess finally, it's this, I wanted to kind of, perhaps this is maybe a little bit more controversial, but I do think that there's when thinking about, whether we always talk about as weather as a public good, and of course it is, right? And that's why we have national weather services, and that it's clear value to the public, and it is a public good. But I do think that in terms of how we achieve public good, we may want to kind of think about or focus on this idea of global access. And again, not to be pedantic, but this idea of if a public, what is good about a public good if it's not globally accessible to everybody because of short-lived funding or intentional or without kind of this intentional programming to ensure that the public good is actually is globally accessible and having the good that it deserves, I guess. And there was a quote in one of the pre-reads that was sent ahead, and it said, donor arrangements have been found to be inefficient and ineffective when they are short-lived project-based interventions, lacking medium or long-term investments, or characterized by under-involvement of recipients, right? And, I think that's kind of a theme that's kind of come out today. And obviously there's kind of major opportunities to kind of, I think, address this through different ways of, approaching that problem. And kind of leveraging, leveraging the engagement of different stakeholders. I'm probably at time, aren't I? But can I make one more point?
Quick one.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. And then I think this kind of addresses one of the comments. But I did want to, we're a nonprofit, but we really do believe in the private sector is being underutilized in the context of weather and climate services, especially in the context of operational long-term services. And going back to my kind of global access point, we want to ensure that there are kind of models for, whether they're new innovations coming out, kind of the satellite-based technology, or whether they're kind of more the dissemination tools that are being proven on the ground. We need to be very intentional about making sure that they do reach the marginalized communities and communities who can most benefit. And the private sector, they have no in a lot of scenarios, they have no immediate financial incentive for them to serve regions or countries, when they've got responsibilities to their shareholders and salaries to pay and R&D to fund. That said, there is a role for kind of short-term donor and philanthropic funding to kind of kickstart the incentive mechanism and channel the value of their innovations to communities. So, and there are different ways of doing that, and we're experimenting and like I with those different models, which I think Ronald will pick up on in the discussion later. But I did want to kind of just flag a few of those ideas, which I understand require more discussion, but I'll stop there and hand it back to
many thanks, Georgina. And again, I think I think it's great if you have actually sort of a discussion and some arguments, and obviously I think there's a point that remains to be settled. I guess what I took away from you was really the focus on how to reach the users and the poorest users that are not being reached as yet. And I guess somewhere also a question where I say you have lots of data generation potential, maybe also at the global level. And that, I mean, is a benefit in terms of the I think global public goods that you mentioned. So how to make sure that public good in terms of knowledge and awareness is becoming available to others who need it. So I think that's key. And I think then questions around that also, effective donor support, how to do that. I think fundamentally also a question that's very important in practice, and maybe we'll come to in the next sessions as well, is the reality of resources scarcity and what's the hierarchy of priorities to be able to to focus scarce resources on. But yeah, and then again, I think, as you said, the focus on really the short-term weather forecasts with higher, obviously higher certainty than longer-term ones, but very important for concrete decisions and actions by those users that you've been focusing on. So fascinating discussion. I'm not trying to sum up any further, but we are already a bit over time. So let me just thank all of you again for the great insights. And let me hand over with that and without further ado to Melody Brown, who already, I think, came in to moderate the next session on lightning talk. So over to you, Melody.
Yeah, thanks. And I'll be sharing my screen. Oh, I can't share my screen. Interesting. Okay, I guess I will not be sharing. Oh, perfect. Yeah. All right. So hi, everyone, again, and thanks for being here and all the exciting comments and discussion so far. Welcome to the session 3 of this session of this event, where we'll be focusing on lightning talks. So you will be hearing from different speakers about specific solutions that they developed to address some of the challenges that we've been talking about already. They will have about 5 minutes each to present their solutions, and then there will be time to ask questions in between each presentation. Before jumping in, let me just introduce myself and tell you a bit more about what we're doing. So I'm Melody Brown. I'm a Senior Research Staff Associate at the International Research Institute for Climate and Society, IRI, at Columbia University. And so IRI, you've heard from John already, IRI has been working on climate services for quite a long time now. So I'll very briefly mention some of some elements of our approach. So you can go to next slide, please. So, we've been talking in this session about 2 things, I would say. One is clearly the importance of having a strong foundation of good quality climate data. And then 2, having mechanisms in place to support the translation, the tailoring, the translation, the communication of that information in a format, in a way that is relevant and appropriate for decision makers and policymakers. So on the first part, on developing the strong climate foundation, we've been working with meteorological departments all around the world. So building on what John was saying, really try to focus on collaboration with the national Met services. And we've been working on a number of things, but I want to briefly present 2 of the tools that we're a bit known for and that are specific challenges. The first thing is we always very often hear that there are data gaps. It can be that a country had a civil war and then they stopped collecting data from their stations for a while, or it could be that sometimes there's lack of maintenance funding available, and so some of the stations are not necessarily always working, and sometimes there are interruptions in the data. It could be just insufficient coverage because they have station data in different parts of the country, but maybe not everywhere. And so because of all of those reasons, sometimes people don't have access to the specific data that they need. So one of our solution to that is something called the ENACT data set, which is in short, a data set that combines together the station data that the national Met services have and satellite data. And it's sort of taking the best of both. So it's bringing higher resolution. Basically, you have coverage for the entire country because you're using satellite data. You have longer time series because satellite data is available for much longer than most of the stations. It's quality controlled. We also have online tools for data analysis and data visualization for this data set. And so altogether, it's just providing better availability, better access, and better use of climate data. And that can be used to analyze data, like events in the past. So for example, for index insurance, we use a lot of that. Or if you want to understand the trends, you can use that to look at what happened over the past 30 years. What's the frequency of the rainy season starting on a specific date, etc. It can be used for the present to monitor real-time conditions. And we also use it to forecast the future, short-term future. So that leads me to my second point, which we already talked a bit about, and there was a bit of discussion about it. So one thing that we hear a lot is, people usually have access and are aware of weather data, so weather forecasts up to a week, 10 days in advance, and they're usually aware of long-term climate scenarios, so kind of end-of-century information. But the problem is, as several of you mentioned earlier, and I think it was either Kathy or Georgina who was saying, one of the questions that people ask is, what should I plant? And that's a very common one. And for us, really, the kind of data that is needed for that is sub-seasonal to seasonal information, because that's going to tell you how the specific season that's coming is likely to look like. So we have our solution to that is this next-gen approach for sub-seasonal and seasonal forecasts. I think one of my colleagues is going to tell you a bit more about it in a bit. But basically, it's a systematic approach to design, implement, produce, and verify objective climate forecasts that are following the WMO standards that Amir mentioned earlier. So it's providing probabilistic forecasts that are really tailored to people in specific sectors. And it's going to give you information like, you know, the frequency of dry days or the onset of the rainy season or extreme temperature. So you can move to the next slide. So those are some of the climate data products that we develop with the Met services. But then, as I was saying, that alone would not work or be sufficient if there was not in parallel a strong engagement with the user community. And the user community includes practitioners and policymakers. So on the other side, we put a lot of efforts into convening, as was mentioned by others earlier, convening the providers of data and then the users of data. And the users are policymakers and decision makers in different sectors. And only when we are able to convene all these people together, then we can co-produce tailored climate products. So what we hear a lot from the user side is that there's no data. They will say, we want to do this, we want to do that, but there's no data. And often there is data, but they're either not aware that it's there or they don't understand it. On the Met department side, what we often hear is we don't exactly know what the needs are in every single sector. And that's often because it's small teams at the Met services that have to work on a lot of different things. And it's nearly impossible for them to engage with people in every single sector and tailor information for every single sector unless they get some support for that. So one solution that we have for that is climate academies. We have them at national level with local partners in different countries. We're building it at global level. And the goal is really to build this functional relationship between all the stakeholders, improve the understanding of needs and information available. And information includes the climate information and the socioeconomic information, and then tailor capacity building based on the needs of the different stakeholders in that group. And so that's really the way for us to develop institutional tools and mechanisms that can make sure that information is communicated to the right people in the right at the right time, in the right format, in a language that they understand. And so we're doing that in different sectors. You're going to hear about dengue prediction, for example, drought prediction in the lightning talks. We also use it for agro advisories, etc. So I'm going to stop there because we want to hear from the different speakers that we have. And so in the first segment of these lightning talks, we have 3 participants. So the first segment will focus on developing the capacity of developing countries in the area of climate services. And we will start with Katharina Lotson, who's an advisor for climate risk management of, she's an advisor for climate risk management of the Enhancing Climate Services for Infrastructure Investment team. So Catherine, sorry, my apologies. Yeah, Catherine, you have the floor. I think you have a presentation.
Sorry, I had some technical issues with Zoom there. Can you see me now? Can you hear me and see me now?
Yes, we can see. Yeah, we can see your slides. So can you talk to us a little bit about how GIZ is making use of capacity development to develop climate information services, and then how are these proving key for infrastructure planning? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the introduction. Yes, I think I will maybe start a bit the other way around, talking about the specificity of climate services for infrastructure first. Of course, I do not need to explain to anybody that infrastructure is important for our societies. But the question that we have that we are facing is that as an infrastructure decision maker, you are making decisions today that are going to affect the availability of public services in 50 years from now, 75, 100 years from now. So these infrastructure decision makers, they have a variety of questions throughout the project cycle for their infrastructure. So at the beginning, you ask yourself, okay, how much electricity is my society going to need in 100 years, taking into account, for example, the question of how much air conditioning will I need because it's going to become hotter. And then later on in the process, you're asking yourself, okay, I want to build my power plant next to a river and what is the 100-year flooding event at this specific location. And of course, what's a 100-year flooding event today, it's going to be a 10-year flooding event, maybe 100 years from now, right? So they're asking themselves all of these questions. And when we started working on this in 2017 with our partners from Brazil, Costa Rica, Vietnam, and the Nile Basin, what we realized is that at that point, the majority of the project was working on agriculture and not so much on infrastructure. And of course, the questions are quite different that you have to be answered in the infrastructure field. So what we try to work with our partners on is to tackle all these different pillars of the global framework of climate services. So the question of observation and monitoring and projections, on the digitalization questions, or the availability of climate information and having data platforms, but most importantly, the user interface. So the value chain basically that was also mentioned by John Farlow at the beginning. So how can we connect the provider to the end user and also involve the intermediates that translate data into services that are usable in the infrastructure field. And of course, we did like baseline assessments to identify capacity gaps and all these kinds of things. But generally, I think I would describe the approach that we took as more of a strengthening what is there and not so much focused on first identify gaps and then fill them, but really looking at what we already have and improving it. So we already had a tool that we were working with, which is a climate risk assessment tool that helps infrastructure decision makers to learn what risks they need to work with, which is the PIVC risk assessment methodology has been developed in Canada and used many, many times in Canada before. And then in each of the countries, we identified a pilot case. I'm going to talk about the case of Costa Rica today, where we worked on a specific bridge in Guanacaste province. And by having a tool, and a tool that is a bottom-up approach, a participatory approach that makes a lot of use of local knowledge, we were able to also bridge some of the data gaps that we encountered along the way because we could draw on this local knowledge. And by bringing together the tool and the pilot case, we also got the people on board. We brought together a team of individuals that represented their institutions. Most importantly, of course, having the hydrometeorological service on board as a major climate service provider and data provider, but also the operator of the infrastructure, the Ministry of Public Works and Transport, and the Costa Rican Engineering Association, which already had experience with the Canadian risk assessment methodology. And bringing all of this together, what it allowed us to do was to draw on this local knowledge, but to also build this local capacity and to build informal networks between all these institutions, because this team worked together and built trust amongst each other. And by this, they did become convinced about the methodology. They learned how to apply it, but they also were able to affect change in their own institutions and build these bigger networks. So basically, we were able to recreate all these different pillars, including the fifth pillar, of course, which is capacity development of the global framework for climate services in all our partner countries, including in the Costa Rican context. But at the same time, we also worked on a broader scale, which is the 4 dimensions of capacity development that we always work on as GIZ, which is working on the enabling environment. I think John Farlow also mentioned before this question of needing to, I'm not sure who mentioned it, but to have this, to entrench this as institutional practice. And one part of making it a practice to use climate services and infrastructure planning is, of course, to have laws and plans in place that make it obligatory to do so. Also, we need to change processes, to do organizational development, to give organizations a process on how to use climate services in the infrastructure planning, which we had with this Canadian methodology. But in Costa Rica even went farther because they developed their own methodology, which is called MERCI, based on the Canadian tool that it can now be used by infrastructure operators all over Costa Rica. And we, of course, built the human capacities. We had this pilot case, which, of course, was a big on-the-job training, but we also have training of trainers that both develop capacities for climate service providers and users in how to climate-proof infrastructure. But also, very importantly, we built networks in the societies that we worked in, starting from this small assessment team that then also in Costa Rica was involved in developing the Costa Rican tool, that also was consulted in the process of adaptation planning and in the decree on infrastructure planning that was launched in 2020. So really these networks and this topic of cooperation and coordination we could cover starting at the grassroots, and then it grew into a bigger working group throughout the project. And now we are basically taking this to the international level, establishing an international practitioners network to work on this subject. So I cannot cover everything we did, but I want to share with you this QR code or link where you can access all the kind of knowledge products that we created throughout our project duration that has now been for 5 years. And yeah, thank you for your attention and looking forward to the discussion. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Katarina. And yeah, thanks for emphasizing the importance of building networks. I think that's really something that came up several times now since the beginning, the fact that you really get to something sustainable when you bring in the different stakeholders along the value chain or along the different components of what you're working on. So in your case, it was engineers and the infrastructure people from the government, as well as the med services. And I like how you said that because they worked together, they developed a trust relationship. And that's what really convinced them that the method was working for them. And that's really what helped them then go ahead and create change in their own organization. So thanks for that. Is there any question in the group for Katarina? I can't see a hand. Anyone? Okay, so maybe no immediate follow-up question. Oh, I see something in the chat. So some interest in capacity development on infrastructure. Is there any other question? Okay, so maybe questions will come up later. But that was really good to see an example of how climate services can be used for infrastructure, because I think we often see it in the agricultural sector, because it's obvious that agriculture is very vulnerable to climate change and climate variability, but it is something that is necessary in every single sector. And so it's interesting to see how these approaches can really apply to any climate sensitive sector. And we'll have more examples in the next lightning talks. So I would like to invite Shannon DeGraff, who's the advisor for international relations at the Meteorological Services of Canada, Environment and Climate Change Canada. Do we have Shannon on?
Yep, good morning, good afternoon.
Fantastic, good afternoon. So the question to you would be, to what extent can early warning systems be nationally owned, sustainable and effective? And how is capacity development helping in that regard?
Great, thank you. I will first start off by saying I am from our meteorological service in Canada, and the work that we're doing in this area is but a very small part of what I do and what our team does. So I'm not as well immersed and knowledgeable in the capacity development realm as many others on this call. So I'll just preface with that. So speaking to, can early warning systems be nationally owned, sustainable and effective? There are certain elements, I would say, of early warning systems that are nationally owned, but to be sustainable and effective, there really has to be a lot of collaboration, both interagency and interdisciplinary, both in the design of the systems and also in the implementation and utilization, and engaging all of the relevant entities in the hydromet value chain to provide that information during potentially high impact weather events on not just what to expect, but also the what to do. A lot of people have already spoke to that this morning of, what needs to be done related to those. And in some cases that could be all within one national government and nationally owned, especially from some of the larger Met services or more advanced Met services like Canada. But I would say as weather doesn't follow the political boundaries, regional support and collaboration is very important in that regard. Also to be cost effective, especially in the LDCs and SIDS that generally don't have those advanced MET services. So developing those tools and systems can be quite costly and unaffordable. So the case study that I'll speak to today, just to provide a bit of context, Canada's allocated $10 million to the climate risk and early warning system, but it was provided to the WMO. This was following from COP21 in Paris in 2015. And our fund supported projects in Southeast Asia, Pacific, and the Caribbean. And as I've noted, we provided our funds to WMO, which is one of the implementing partners of CRUISE. And so I will point out in this context that this is more of a WMO success story rather than a Meteorological Service of Canada success story. So the project that I'm going to focus on is related to flash flooding in the Dominican Republic. And although the WMO and other entities have provided support improving early warning system capabilities, in the Dominican Republic was lacking an operational hydrological system for riverine floods, which meant there was a lack of ability to forecast and provide the warnings of impending flash floods, which in the Caribbean account for a significant number of lost lives and property damage. And this gap in the Dominican was primarily due to minimal budgets, insufficient collaboration amongst the hydrometeorological services, and limited qualified personnel. To address this gap, the WMO, working in collaboration with a number of other organizations, developed a fully operational integrated riverine flood forecasting, or IRFF, system for the Dominican Republic. And this included both developing tools and providing training for how to use those tools. So the IRFF system built on the improvement of existing flood forecasting products to implement impact-based flood forecasting in 2 river basins in the Dominican Republic as pilot projects. And the IRF system used data and products from existing systems such as severe weather forecasting program, flash flood guidance, coastal inundation forecasting initiative, and the national stream flow forecasting. And not only have the tools and the models available to the relevant organizations been strengthened through the integration of the IRFF system, but so have the technical capacities of staff. Virtual training on numerical weather prediction, operational hydrology, and flood management were conducted to improve the understanding, the interpretation, and operation of the new system. And then furthermore, local in-person workshops were organized to involve the stakeholders from the disaster risk management agencies. So the sort of takeaways from this project include the value in a pilot project and scaling up. The implementation of the IRFF system has provided Dominican Republic's National Institute of Water Resources with fully operational hydrological riverine system floods that it was lacking. And by undertaking this as a pilot in 2 of the country's river basins, this has paved the way for potential scaling up in other basins in the country. And this includes, and the staff will already have been trained in the technical capacities to help deliver this scaling up. The importance of collaboration. The head of the Dominican Republic's National Institute of Water Resources noted the importance of the interinstitutional collaboration for these complex issues. He highlighted that at every stage, a multidisciplinary project involving different agencies, there will always be improved understanding and vision around a situation or problem when collaboration is strong. And then similar to the above, but the importance of building relationships in the early warning system value chain, including those organizations that provide the forecast, those that communicate the forecast, including to the emergency management organizations. The additional benefits realized through this project included the strengthened cooperation and support among these agencies that link the hydrometeorology The strengthened relationships allow for improved response and contingency plans in the face of events due to flooding. And clearly outlined plans and strong relationships prior to a crisis will benefit the citizens of the Dominican Republic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shannon. So yeah, very good example of how to use climate services and this capacity development for a flood forecasting approach. So I have a question for you, but I want to see first if there's anybody in the audience that has some questions on this, or any of the other panelists who would like to react. And I don't see any immediate hands. So one question that I had was, you talked a lot about the interagency collaboration and how this project helped support that. And because this is a flood project, I was curious to know if the flood folks within the ministry and the climate people were, first of all, is it in the same ministry or different ministries? And were they already working together at all before this project, or did you have to build that? By experience in some countries that we work in, it's not that easy to necessarily get all of these people together, because the flood people sometimes just focus on the flood forecast, and they do use some climate information, but they don't necessarily interact regularly with the climate people. And yeah, so there's sometimes a disconnect between those two. So I was curious to ask you a little more about that, if you can share.
And I will be very frank, we weren't the on-the-ground project deliverers of this. We were providing the funding for these projects. So that I'm not sure. I do know, you know, from other examples, yes, there are countries where those agencies are, even within Canada and like where I am and other advanced countries, sometimes they're together, sometimes there's not. So yeah, I mean, I don't know in this instance particularly, but building those relationships is sometimes the very first step of developing those systems and tools.
Yeah, no problem. And it's really good to see that yeah, they did work together clearly on this project to develop this early warning system. So great, thank you very much. And again, if people in the audience have more questions, feel free to either put them in the chat or ask them a bit later. There's a general question. So I'll go with micro so that we can finish the first segment. And then I'll just briefly ask all three if they want to talk a little bit about the role of private sector in those projects, if any. But first, let me give the floor to Beatriz Vaca Dominguez, who's the Chief Operating Officer at Microinsurance Catastrophe Risk Organization, MICRO. And Beatrice, the question for you is, how do you reach underserved populations and help them develop their resilience against climate-related hazards? And to what extent is capacity development central to those efforts? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Melody and Juan, for the invitation. So MICRO is specialized on the design and implementation of index-based microinsurance that enables protection against natural disasters to vulnerable population. And Juan, if you can go to the next one, please. The way that we do that is designing the most important part of our work is the design and implementation of index-based insurance that we try to make simple, relevant, covering the most relevant perils for everyone insured. I think the most important thing is that we are trying to design low-cost products that are not depending on subsidies. That is very important, and also trying to make them tangible with a level of payments that allow people to be aware that they are really insured and the insurance really works for those events. We have our own calculation platform. We are using climate data information that others produce, and we use it in the calculation platform for the means of the insurance product. We work with partners from the private and public sector in each of the countries where we operate. So we are doing this index-based insurance, but we are also trying, and I say trying because it's the most difficult part of it, to put in place some other risk management strategies, because we think that the insurance is not the only solution. It's not the only solution, and people should be aware on how they could build a holistic strategy to manage their climate-related risk. So we do some financial education focus on how do you put together insurance with savings, with intelligent credit for some kind of investment, but always in a manner where risk is managed in a very complete way. And also we put together other companies' products or services together with our insurance product. We try, for example, to link the recommendations of the agroclimatic technical tables to our insurance. So we try first to help them to reduce the risk, and then tell them how to use insurance to take the residual part of the risk. You can go to the next, thank you. And answering the question of capacity development, I think capacity development is central in each step of the chain using climate services for climate-related risk management. From regulation, because regulators need to understand better the use of climate information for insurance and other financial instruments like forecast-based finance. In terms of design, in order to ensure that the products fulfill population's needs, it will be very useful to have more accurate inventories of damages and also have national data available in a timely and reliable manner. We know that in each country where we work, the national meteorological system has the information, but not always in a reliable manner. So normally we cannot use it for the operation of the product. We can use it in some phases of the design phase. And also it would be very helpful for the design of double trigger indices if national early warning and catastrophe management systems, those who are in charge of emergency or catastrophe declarations, have transparent methodologies with objective criteria for the declaration of events. That is really crucial to improve the confidence, the trust of international reinsurance in these local declaration systems. I think that is a very important point to improve the indices and reduce basis risk, at least in development countries. In terms of distribution, there are a lot of challenges here. From the identification of beneficiaries, where do they have their assets to be protected? It seems really simple, but it is not in some developing countries. The only thing that we have to know is where are the assets to be protected, and even with this little information, sometimes we struggle to have that information accurate. And so that is a main challenge, and the other is the linkage with other risk management strategies as the agroclimatic technical tables, because it is, as you said, Melody, the information is there. The forecasts are they are pretty much accurate, but how do you manage legal and moral responsibility of using those forecasts for anticipatory measures in the field? How the smallholder farmers could use the available climate information if nobody wants to take the responsibility to tell them if it is or not the good moment to seed. They don't speak in terms of probability. They don't understand 40% of probability of rain. They need some more accurate, more precise recommendations. And it's very difficult to tell a farmer what should he or he should do, even if you know that the information is more or less accurate. I think that is a good area of opportunity of work here on helping countries and national systems of early warnings to work this part of responsibility and maybe take more risk in a lot of countries. Even though they have the information, they don't dare to give a specific recommendation because the responsibility against them could be very high if they are wrong or if the recommendation is not really accurate. In terms of operation, the use of technology is much needed to make possible that unbanked population is able to access insurance and to get a payout in case of climate-related events. That is a big part of it also. And finally, in terms of M&E, most of the time our local partners don't have the capacity to systematize what is really happening in the field, and those participate to the index reliability and client value assessment. So we do that with our means, but it will be helpful if national systems could take the information of what's happening in the field with more precise information. We know that in a department in Guatemala is happening a catastrophe, for example, but we don't know exactly in what point of the map that event is occurring. In terms of monitoring, it's very important for enterprises as us to be able to, after the event, put together all the information. And I think my 5 minutes are over. So thank you very much. And let's open for any questions you may have.
Yeah, thank you so much, Beatriz. And I think Index Insurance is a good example of another strategy where there really needs to be collaboration across sectors. So the private sector obviously has to be included because you need insurance companies, but then you have to include the communities in the development of the product. Otherwise, the product is not going to respond to their needs. And then you need to include the different data providers. So yeah, thank you for walking us through all of that. I wanted to highlight one thing that you said that I think is very important, that we've also faced a lot in index insurance projects. It's the fact that it's sometimes difficult to use the meteorological department data for index insurance if it's not guaranteed to be available when you need it. And so you've mentioned that. I think that's a really good point, and that's a hint for the people working for Met Services here on the call that you know, for index insurance, you really need to make sure that you will have access to the data at the time when you're doing the monitoring and when you're triggering the payouts. Otherwise, that can create delays. And then the other thing is, if the data is not available for free, then that the cost of the data will be added to the premium that farmers will have to pay, which is also sometimes an issue. We're running a bit behind on time, I believe, but are there questions in the chat or in the audience? Is there anyone who wanted to ask a follow-up question? And if not, I just very, very, very quickly want to give a chance to Shannon and Katarina to say something about the private sector, since that was one of the questions, but maybe just in like 30 seconds, if you have anything to add. If not, then we'll move to the second segment.
If you don't mind me, just a very quick comment on this question, because I think what we noticed in terms of private sector's role, of course, like in the future, they can take a role in being a customer of climate service for infrastructure, but we only worked on public infrastructure. But they often take the role of the intermediate providers, so translating climate data into a service. So we often had experts from the consulting industry doing this kind of service, making a service out of the climate data, both in terms of engineering experts, but also in terms of climate experts. And the question for us now would be, how can you, because these intermediates often where international experts came from Canada or Germany, so how can you have these kinds of experts in the countries that we're working with to make it more sustainable in the future?
Absolutely, and that's where, yeah, the role of capacity building is important, because you may not have these local experts at the moment, but then it's in several projects lifetime, then maybe you will be able to over time build that capacity in the country, so that you don't have that reliance on external projects, external experts that are flying in and out. So yeah, very, very good points. Okay, I don't see any other hand up. So let's move to the second segment. So next slide. The second segment is focusing on supporting countries with data for climate change. And we will first hear from Mr. Ronald Dianga, who's the Kenya country manager for Tomorrow Now. So Ronald, the question to you is, what type of partnerships can facilitate capacity development to gather and use relevant climate change data? And what are your experiences in the case of Kenya? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Maybe just before we begin, I had a presentation that I shared. I don't know if it can be brought up kindly. Good. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Yeah, so first and foremost, I must say thank you very much for all of us who've spoken before. I think I esteem the words of the panelists that went before. And then, of course, the first round of the first segment. I think they really said very interesting and important things. So colleagues, really, my role today is very simple. And I just want to reflect with you and take you on a journey to try and explore and see how can we better leverage on advanced, weather technologies and advanced weather tools for climate preparedness and action. Because again, the reality of the matter is that in my experience as a Kenyan farmer, and more importantly, having the opportunity to interact with various farmers every day in the country and around the continent, climate change is impacting our farms every day. And again, through the experience that I have gathered and I have had, it's really important, and I've come to realize that weather intelligence is really, really key in helping me as a farmer to be able to, be better prepared. And really, this has made me understand the usefulness of climate change data. But also, interestingly, is the fact that over the period of time that I've worked as a farmer, and of course, working with farmers, I've come to realize the importance, again, of leveraging on this particular advanced climate data tools for the general good of farmers. But the interesting bit now is we have a whole organization dedicated to bridging this and transferring all these amazing advanced weather and climate innovations, data, and tools to impact more farmers like myself and others. And the unique position is Tomorrow Now is leveraging on a multi-stakeholder approach to make sure that we can be able to work better. And really, this is personally why I believe in the Tomorrow Now mission, because the whole purpose why we were founded was because of the need for climate preparedness and the opportunity that exists in helping, like Georgina had mentioned earlier, helping people that are most impacted but don't have the ability or are least equipped to adapt and even be able to act. So this is really the whole point why we're founded as Tomorrow Now. And I'll give, in the course of my presentation, an example of really how partnerships are really critical in helping us to be able to, invest in the transformation that we want to see tomorrow. So literally taking control of our tomorrow now, but in a collaborative approach. And that's why I mentioned of our unique multi-stakeholder approach. And through the work we do at Tomorrow Now, we leverage on our convening power to work together with various partners in that collaborative front. And again, these partners come from all farm organizations to the private sector that have been mentioned over and over again in the course of this conversation, but also scientific communities that are really also critical in bringing their voices in. But the other important partners and partnerships that we also forge are with the public sectors because of their national scale of how they're able to deliver these climate services. And so I just want to reflect with you on one of the key partnerships that I mentioned about, and this is with the private sector, because really there is massive opportunity. And the unfortunate bit would be that this particular massive opportunity with these new technologies and these different climate innovations will not have impact unless it reaches those that are in need. And I think this is something that has been mentioned before. And therefore, for us, we believe on the idea that the private sector climate innovations, data, and tools must be made available to communities for them to make a difference. So really, reflecting back on what Bill Gates said, that it's important that for us to harness the opportunity with these particular innovations and tools, for them to reach their full potential, we must be able to have the injection of philanthropic capital and partnerships. And that's why the conversation around partnerships and collaborations are really critical in helping us to understand that. This slide, I wouldn't take much of my time on this slide, but I want to give you a practical example of OSIRIS, which is a project we are running here in Kenya, funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And the core objective of this project is to close the weather and climate data gap. And through this project, we aim to develop and really assess also some of the existing initiatives, but also to be able to augment the value of weather data and tools for seed breeders and crop modelers. So again, here we leverage and hinge, and this project is much hinged around our multi-stakeholder approach. And again, like I said, we are a farmer-first organization and are very keen through Project OSIRIS to amplify the voice of the farmer through very intentional ways of engagement. And like we co-design and co-develop solutions, but first understanding what is the perspective of the farmer and moving that into the various initiatives that we are doing. And so the first collaborative front is we, the farmers themselves, who are the end users of this particular climate innovations and data and tools that are available. I think this has been spoken about in this particular call more than once. The private sector's role is really critical. And this is a very strategic partnership that is going to help us, because for us, really, we believe that the private sector innovations can impact communities. And this is the reason why we are partnering with the private sector to bring this much needed opportunity in their technologies to the communities that are in need. But also the other important partnership through Project OSIRIS, like I said, that we're working with the scientific community. And of course, for Project OSIRIS specifically, we are working very closely with RIGRO and CGIR, for instance. And what we're doing is we are making sure that their voice is represented in the design of these new solutions, this new climate data, and this new climate innovation that are coming up, and even the tools that are being developed, so that then through this particular, once we weave their feedback also on their thoughts on, then we can be able to leverage on the good research that they already have collected and the data that they also have gathered over the time. And lastly, I think I've mentioned this, and I listened to, I think, Amir speak, and Amir from the World Meteorological Organization. And really, the critical piece of public sector organization cannot be underscored. Because if you look at organizations in Kenya, for instance, like the Kenya Agricultural Livestock Research Organization, who have responsibility of transferring these climate services at a national level, we believe that through the work we're doing with OSIRIS, we are going to support and enable them to deliver these very critical services. If I just maybe, as I end, reflect back on what Georgina said, that you walk into meteorological departments, or even organizations like CalRO, and the key question that farmers like me would ask is, what is the weather tomorrow? What can I plant? And those are really critical questions for us as farmers. But the important piece and the place where these organizations like CalRO plays is that they are providing these particular climatic services to farmers, and therefore partnering with them for us at Tomorrow Now is really critical to making sure that we are able to support them and enable them deliver these services that are really timely and that are really, really important for farmers. So I think I'll just kind of end and leave it at that. I just want to say it's really critical that we must leverage on these partnerships. And that's why really for us at Tomorrow Now, the multi-stakeholder approach is really critical in making sure that we are able to bring, or through this convening power, different partners to be able to solve the problems that we care about the most. So this slide was just speaking to weather intelligence cuts across all the SDGs, and that's something that is known to all of us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ronald, and thanks for emphasizing again the importance of reaching the last mile and really working with farmers on the development of these tools, and then giving us the experience from Kenya. So we are behind on time, so if you have questions, please go ahead and put them in the chat, and I'll ask all the speakers to keep an eye on the chat so that if there is a question specifically for you, you can answer in the chat. And we'll just, I see that there are some comments or questions, so please feel free to communicate in the chat so that we can keep going with the presentations. And very quick question for the next presenters, please make sure that you stick to 5 minutes so that we have enough time for all the remaining presentations. So we're now going to listen to Matthias Jara, who's a statistical consultant at the National Institute of Statistics in Paraguay. And Matthias, we would like you to talk to us about some of the challenges from the Paraguay's climate change data portal, and how has capacity development been a key enabler to develop such a tool? And if you can share some lessons learned from the portal, that would be great. Thank you so much. The floor is yours, and 5 minutes.
Hi, Melody. Hi, everyone. First, I would like to thank you for the organizer and the National Institute of Paraguay for the invitation to me today. Okay, before I answer the question, I would like to go through my presentation, like the conditions, the needs, and the inputs in order to identify all the needs for this development of the atlas. Next, please, Juan. Okay, first, the condition: approximately half of the SDG indicators contain the construction information required for all the environmental variables. According to a new assessment doing by the INE, here all the 60% of the indicators will come from administrative records, and there is a project here in Paraguay supporting by the European Union and the FIAT, with its Atlas on Environmental and Climate Change Statistics. Next, please. Another kind of condition, this work will be carried in order to like a multi-sectoral, multi-agency development, especially with the MADES, which is the Ministry of Environment here in Paraguay. And this work proposed is a concept framework through the review of the systematization of national and international experience. Especially here in Paraguay, we will also have the Atlas of Gender, the Disaster Risk Atlas, and from other countries, we will take like the environmental and climate atlases, especially an example of a model from Ecuador here. Next, please. Next. Okay, the creation of this atlas will be also response to the monitoring and follow-up of all the international commitment, the national and especially the sectoral and local plans here in Paraguay. And this process also identify the initial inputs, especially the importance of the law, the special of the new NDS plan, with development with the supporting of Paris 21, especially the SDG assessment, which includes all the information of environmental sector. Another, in the next slides, we will see like the yearbook of a statistical yearbook, which give official information about the statistical information generated by the National Statistical Office and other public institutions from Paraguay. These yearbook include data of territory, hydrology, and climatology data. Another important input is the water information system, which is a database water information which is development with the support of Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data in coordination with the public institution in this sector. From all these inputs identified in the next slides, we will be like the important of multi-sectoral, multi-agency, which is all the stakeholders involved in this process. We will see that in these slides is the public, the private sector, and all the ONEs. Finally, in the next topic, we will see like the importance of an innovation in the new regulatory decree of the new statistical law of the INE. In this process, we will include the importance of the natural resources to make the operations in this system. Finally, the main challenge in this development of this atlas is to promote the stretching in the statistical area to strengthen the process in the methodological and development in the environmental issues, and to also achieve the periodicity and statistical operation. And this is all. Thank you. 5 minutes, Melody.
Wow, thank you so much. That was great. Thank you very much. So I'm going to continue, but again, I invite everyone to ask their questions in the chat so that you can follow up on the specific example of Paraguay. So we're now going to hear from Carmen Gonzalez Romero, who's a staff associate and country manager for a climate services project in Latin America at IRI. And Carmen, what we want to hear from you is how your program is strengthening the capacities of local partners in Latin America, and what type of stakeholders do you target to transform the way in which climate-related data can help relieve the country's development challenges. The floor is yours, 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. I'm trying to be short and sweet. So my name is Carmen Gonzalez Romero. I work with Melody, John, and many others at the IRI. In order to answer Melody's question a bit, I put some slides together. If you could go to the next one, please. Fantastic. Okay, it looks a little bit weird, but I think you can see the images. So the way we work at the IRI is we always work around the concept of climate services, which you can see the image on the right-hand side. Those climate services are built on 4 pillars: the generation of climate information, but also knowledge, the translation, the transfer, and the use. It's very important, the use, because otherwise not really climate services. And through this project called Act Today, but also many others, we have been developing the concept called climate services ecosystems. As you can see on the left-hand side, the image, the ecosystem represent the connection between the different tools, services, data, capacity building activities that we do in the countries we work with. In particular, this one is for a project called Act Today. As you can see at the bottom left of the image, you can see an image with a circle that represents the Climate Services Academy. But that's not the only capacity building activity we've done in the countries. Actually, for every single picture of the ecosystem, we do one capacity building or several capacity building activities, because all the services that we provide or that we co-implement and we co-design depend on the institutions we work with. At the end of the day, everything we do is demand-driven, so everything has to go through these 3 co-step systems, so co-design, co-development, and co-implementation. And in particular, maybe if you click next, I'm going to talk about 2 examples, and now like real life examples. One is what's the other one? One is the system for monitoring and forecast cases of acute undernutrition for children under 5 in Guatemala, and the other one is an example at the regional scale in Central America, well, North America, Central America, and Northern South America for monitoring and forecasting of environmental suitability for diseases like Zika, dengue, chikungunya. So if you want to move next, please. Next slide. Thank you. I don't know why the presentation looks like that. Apologies. I swear to God, it was, it looked fine in my laptop. But the first example is this monitoring forecast system of cases of acute undernutrition for children under 5. You can see in the left-hand side, we've been working with the CESAN, which is the Secretary of Food Security and Nutrition of Guatemala, to not only monitor the cases that they have, or they monitor through the system, but also to forecast the number of cases of children with acute nutrition per department with a four-month lag. We included not only climate data, but also socioeconomic data, because not everything depends on climate. And the idea is to help design the decision-making process. Everything from the design of the map on the left-hand side to the histogram on the bottom right-hand side, everything is being made by this co-design between the two institutions. And an element or a basic element of the project is to transfer that capacity building so they can continue with this system once they are once the project finishes. And since stage 1, what you do, you focus on the co-development and in the capacity building, because it goes like bi-directional. We learn from them, from the concept concept we built on the model, but also they learn from us certain abilities that they might not have excel at yet. Next one. I'm trying to be very fast. I'm very conscious of time. Yeah. The next one is Aedes, environmental suitability map room for Aedes mosquitoes. In particular, these two mosquitoes, the Aegypti and albicus, they are the ones that causes cases of Zika, chikungunya, and dengue. Environmental suitability is one of the 3 components that are key for the transmission of the disease. We also need to look at the vector and virus presence, but also socioeconomic factors. So using environmental suitability, temperature, precipitation, and vulnerability data, we built this model that used the basic reproductive number, or not. We all know about this because of COVID. We're very familiar with that. And it allows to better prepare for future outbreaks. It was funded by NOAA, but we had a very different stakeholders involved here. One of them is PAHO, the Pan American Health Organization, but also we're working with Ministry of Health from different countries, especially Central America and North America and South America, to develop dengue cases using Aedes as a predictor. So that's all from my side. There's also, we follow the same approach, so there's a co-development and capacity building across every single stage of the process. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Carmen. And then if anyone has any further question on how to use climate information to predict dengue and chikungunya and Zika, feel free to go ahead and ask questions in the chat or follow up with Carmen. So that's it for our segment 2. So we have one more segment, and last but not least, a segment focusing on seeds. So we'll start with Jackie Spence Hemmings, who has to go soon. So I'm bumping her up as the first. She's the climate branch head of the Meteorological Service Division of Jamaica. And Jackie, what we would like you to tell us about is talk to us about an example of a particular challenge that Jamaica has been facing and how you managed to lift that challenge through capacity development and working with the donor community. Thanks. The floor is yours. And again, 5 minutes. Thanks.
Thank you, Melody, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Okay, so I will be quite quick because I don't have a formal presentation, so I'll just speak. So in Jamaica, we were having issues with drought. We were having drought events more frequently, and it basically was catching us, unprepared. We were reacting to the situation after the fact. It was resulting in significant loss in the agricultural sector, water lockoffs, which, for household use, that could mean, several impacts, including, the hygiene issues and such. So it was a real challenge for us. And then we had an intervention of a development of a drought tool, which was with funding from USAID in collaboration with IRI, which Melody is quite aware of, and John. And through this collaboration, we were able to develop a tool which allowed both forecasting of drought and monitoring. So that allowed us to be better prepared for these events. If they would happen, or if we saw the likelihood of them happening, then things could have been put in place to prevent them from being as devastating as they were before. And we saw coming out of this where the water suppliers were able to do water lockoffs in a more controlled way to save water, so that when the need came for us, if the rains didn't come, then we would have some water in storage to provide for household use and other uses. Additionally, the agricultural persons could prepare in the sense of rainwater harvesting and several other techniques to ensure that they were better prepared when a drought came. Additionally, we also had the expansion of the data collection network, because we do know that the data underpins everything. So the data collection network was expanded through the installation of automatic weather stations, and this was through the PPCR pilot project for climate resilience. The funding was through the Climate Investment Fund, CIF, and that gave a significant boost to the network and allowed us to collect more data, more parameters across a greater expanse of the country. So the two came together in a nice way, and we are building on this, and we still have issues, but at least we now have something in place to now try to replicate for other sectors. So we basically currently target agriculture and water, but of course health, tourism are other sectors that we have to consider, because we do know that these are also, very important, and tourism is one of the main economic sectors for Jamaica. So it's, very relevant. And key lessons coming out of these interventions, we realize that interventions by donor organizations, it should include a monitoring and evaluation strategy to ensure the continuity of the projects. We also realize that in the case of when equipment is purchased, it is key that the sustainability of these equipment, so that maintenance portion, needs to be factored in somehow to ensure that, this is maintained going forward. And we know that the government budgets don't always allow this. So what can be done sometimes is, when the equipment is purchased, some spares are purchased along with that to give a little offset, so that, maybe by the time that is finished, hopefully we can, would have some monies now available to purchase additional spares going forward. Also, we realize that the collaborations with organizations such as USAID and academia such as IRI affords capacity building of the meteorological and hydrological services, who usually lack the resources needed to do these kinds of research and development. So we find these collaborations very, very important and very helpful, especially for SIDS, whom we know, usually have very limited resources, both in people and capacity. And that is it for me, Melody. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jackie. That was fast, much appreciated, and very interesting too. So thanks for flagging again the issues of maintenance and continuity between projects. And this is a call for other people on the call to reach out if there's a way to support, to collaborate with Jamaica on other sectors than ag and water. So we have two more. So we're now giving the floor to Christophe Buffet from Adaptation at AFD, the French Agency for Development, and then Marie-Dominique Leroux, who's Deputy Director of Climatology and Studies Division at Météo France. So the question for you is, what type of capacity development activities have you developed to support SIDS and what kind of results have you been able to observe? And again, 5 minutes max, so that we have one more presentation and can finish on time. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your invitation. Hello, Melody. It's great to see you again. I'm Christophe Buffet. I'm the Program Manager of Adaptation at AFD. Let me say a few words about this program. Through technical assistance and capacity building activities, Adaptation Program helps countries and regional organizations in Africa, among LDCs and SEEDs, to better integrate adaptation in their governance tools, public policies, and investments. A first phase has leveraged more than 580 million euros of projects funded by AFD or co-funded with other donors, such as the GCF or the EU. And BRIO is one of the research activities for which we provided financial and technical support. It has to be noted that we intend to keep on fostering science policy action interface with the second phase of adaptation that is organized around 3 pillars: understanding, planning, investing. But we can come back to this in the discussion. I leave now the floor to Marie-Dominique to present you BRIO. Thank you.
Thank you, Christophe, and hello, everyone. To start with, SWAIO stands for Southwest Indian Ocean, and IOC for Indian Ocean Commission. So in the SWAIO basin, we had to face capacity gaps and challenges. There were no climate services in the SWAIO basin before 2018, no climate modeling in the IOC countries, and no climate information to rely on for the IOC very steep and small islands. As illustrated at the bottom left, you can see a shortcoming of global climate models is their low resolution, and they cannot well represent the islands, they just see water. So, well, the small islands, except for Madagascar, and therefore the precipitation climatology is misrepresented. And at the right-hand side, you can see that the regional climate models were run at 50-kilometer resolutions through the Codex exercise over the Africa regions, but this region did not cover the entire basin, and therefore they misrepresented the TC climatology and therefore the precipitation climatology over the basin. So getting climate data information over the SWAIO is of high stakes in the context of climate change, because the coastal population is exposed to sea level rising because of the tropical cyclone hazard, both increasing the geopolitical risk. And next slide, please. Thank you. So we tested a solution was to run regional climate modeling using Aladdin at 12-kilometer resolution, driven by one of the CEMIP6 simulation. So it is illustrated at the bottom left. You can see that the terrain in the regional climate model is well seen. And this refined terrain allows refined precipitation over the islands, as illustrated here over Madagascar on the right-hand side, going from the 150 global climate resolution to the 12-kilometer regional climate resolution. Next slide, please. So I will finish by commenting this mind map that summarizes everything we did within the BRIO project. Starting on the left-hand side in green, to build capacity, we trained regional experts within the IOC countries, Madagascar, Comoros, Seychelles, Mauritius, and Reunion Island. In red on the top left, we helped them build or consolidate homogeneous reference data sets over the historical period, 1981-2014. And at the right-hand side on the top, in blue, as we said, we ran regional climate projections covering 3 scenarios from the most optimistic to the most pessimistic one, and for a long-term period covering 1981 to the end of the century. The 12-kilometer resolution climate data over the basin helped us look at tropical cyclone projections. And we also used the homogeneous reference data sets that we created for model bias correction over the IOC islands, enabling downscaling at 3 to 4 kilometer resolution over these islands. At the right in orange, all this data, as well as climate indices, are available on a free access online portal. And at the bottom left, all this data started to feed climate services in various sectors, such as health, water resources, agriculture, biodiversity, and national adaptation and mitigation policies. And illustrated at the bottom right is the fact that we also quantify climate uncertainty using, it's not well seen, but using a pool of semi-fixed global climate model. And it's illustrated here for the temperature rising. Thank you for your attention.
Fantastic, thank you so much. And I think that's a great example of also how to use regional climate projections. So we haven't been talking about those too much, so that's a great complementary presentation from what we've been talking about earlier. So same thing, if you have questions, please put them in the chat. We'll have a few minutes after the last presenter, but I just want to go to the last presentation. So Mr. Msholishi Sibanda, I'm very sorry if I'm not pronouncing your name properly. So advisor on climate change for the Commonwealth Secretariat. And the question to you is, how can you build the resilience of small island nations through the use of innovative technologies and capacity development? The floor is yours.
Thank you, Melody, and a big thank you to everyone that's persisted and persevered through the amount of detail and presentations this afternoon. I'm going to talk a little bit about our work in the Pacific, where we have been supporting 3 small island developing countries, Fiji, Vanuatu, and Solomon Islands, on a collaborative project with those 3 governments and a number of other partners from the private sector, from the UK Met Service Office, as well as researchers from the University of Portsmouth. For many of you that might not know, the Commonwealth is an association of now 56 independent states. And so our role as the Secretariat is really to support those different countries, and particularly for the climate change section on climate related issues and building up their resilience. So one of the critical things that we have to deal with from a country level has been issues of finance, climate finance. And Amir and Kathy have mentioned that in previous presentations about the importance of finance. And so from the Commonwealth Secretariat angle, we've come from that perspective that we need to support countries with climate finance. And so in the collaboration, when we designed the project, we, however, were aware with our collaborators that climate information and climate issues go beyond just finance. And so the project was designed in such a way that we provided climate information for climate finance, so proposal development and monitoring and evaluation of that, but also that it could be used for disaster risk resilience, food security, and all the other issues that come into play when one thinks about climate change. And this is a very important thing. And I think someone did mention the whole point about partnerships. I think it's very, very important when you do these sorts of projects and support work, particularly capacity building, is to realize that actually climate change speaks to so many areas. It's an interdisciplinary issue. So with that in mind, what we've done through this project is to leverage on information that's available. We've brought together information, geospatial information that has been put into analysis-ready data that the countries can use. Sometimes the data that can be available might not be analysis ready, but we worked with one of our private sector collaborators to just make sure that the information that was available to the countries was analysis ready information with over 6,000 data files that they could draw on. And so this information has been used in a variety of ways, whether it's tsunami risk area mapping in Solomon Islands, food susceptibility mapping of communities, and vulnerability assessments. For us, because finance is such an important element, and I think that when we think about finance is important for the countries in addressing climate change and increasing their resilience. And in a large way, it's also important in ensuring that the data availability continues into the future. And I think that needs to always be at the back of our minds when we think of finance. So what we've done, we've used that information for development of applications. So for planning, we've also continued to use it for feasibility studies. One of the challenges for many of these countries when they apply for climate finance is that there is so much information that's needed, that is rigorous, that is independent. And so what we've done, we've been able to leverage on that analysis ready data in feasibility studies that then prove the case for climate finance for them. In terms of the capacity building, so we've done workshops, and I think it's important that that is done, and many of us do that. But we've designed the workshops with the countries in such a way that they actually work on live projects that they are working on, and that helps with embedding those skills. It's a continuous process, and it's something that oftentimes you think you're done, but you've got to do it again and again. The other element to the capacity building in terms of the use of the data has been to work in conjunction with the University South Pacific. And I think it's important that whatever support we lend to countries, that it's long-term and has a future, and that has been one of the ways that we've done that. Finally, on the point of the training and the capacity building, we've also looked at the institutional frameworks within the countries. And for example, in Fiji, one of the things that we've really supported is to ensure that there is a climate finance unit that will then be able to work together with the universities and house this sort of capacity going forward. So 3 key lessons that I would probably conclude with and share with you is from our work is that access to tangible, measurable, usable, accessible geospatial information is vital and important. That we all need to think long-term. Institutional support is important. Individual training of staff, particularly in governments, cannot be overemphasized. Look at other partners within countries like universities to try and embed capacity going forward. I think that if we do those things, it goes a long way to ensuring that whatever efforts we do have a long-term impact. One of the things that we are now learning, and this is the last lesson, is the fact that we had all this data, we have all this data, but for proposal development, you often have got to tailor make the data for use by countries. And so we're now going into a second phase of this project where we will be looking specifically at how we can tailor the solutions through the platform that we've provided in the 3 countries going forward. Thank you very much, Melody.
Thank you so much. So this was our last presentation, and I have to say I'm just very impressed by all the different content that's been presented. As you said, it's a lot. We lost a few people, but we still have a very good attendance, so it shows that people are interested, and I think there's no other space like the PCCB to really bring people together around what they've been doing. So we've really been able to cover the importance of the full range of data sets and data products, and the full range of information at different timescales that are needed to really develop tailored solutions that work for people in different sectors. We've been talking about the full range of expertise and backgrounds that are also needed in those conversations. So, everyone has been re-emphasizing the importance of having all these different stakeholders in the room and having them interact with each other. And obviously the role of capacity building at every step of the way was really highlighted by all the speakers, and the fact that really we don't need more top-down technical capacity building, but rather this exchange where different stakeholders learn from each other and are able to have these horizontal mutual capacity building dialogues, and the importance of repetition repeating as well. So I think a lot was said about that. In terms of the challenges, there's always the challenge of the lifetime of projects, and how do we build something that's sustainable? How do we bring attention to the donors to the fact that money is needed not just to develop new products, but also to maintain them. So have systems in place to support the Met departments in the long term to problem solve when they need. We've touched upon finance needs. We've touched upon the role of private sector. So I've seen a number of interactions in the chat of people who plan to follow up with each other on some of these topics. There clearly are synergies and opportunities for further collaboration. And so apologies for the rush to the end of this session, but yeah, fantastic presentations from everyone. So thank you so much. And I'll give back the floor to the OECD and the PCCB. Thanks.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. I think I'll also be very short to make sure, Alejandro has a few words. It's just a huge thank you to all of you. Hugely inspiring and interesting conversation, and certainly lots to follow up on. And it was a pleasure to have you all, and very much looking forward to continuing the conversation, and also to bring this into our work on how we provide analysis and advice to our donor members, so that we hopefully can see a good follow-up action, or encourage it at least from our side. And with that, over to Alejandro, and thanks again.
Thank you very much, Jens, and everyone. It was indeed a great event. I won't take that long. I think we went a bit over time, but it was worth it, I would say. So just to say that on behalf of the PCCB and the UN Climate Change Secretariat, I would really like to thank the OECD for taking the lead on this fantastic series, and particularly for this event, the Columbia Climate Schools International Research Institute for Climate and Society was a successful organization of this second workshop, the OECD PCCB Network Workshop Series. With a focus on climate services and data, these discussions and presentations we heard today have surely built the capacity of everyone that tuned in and stayed all the way to the end. And it's obvious that this session has been able to mobilize important stakeholders from the capacity building community. And I would like to thank also all the contributors. I won't mention every single one because of time, but really a big thanks to everyone. And it's evident that the capacity building community is made up of diverse stakeholders, each of them playing their own role in enhancing climate-related competencies to deliver timely climate action and raise climate ambition. That being said, just to mention that the PCCB, as a constituted body under the Convention and serving the Paris Agreement, has the mission to enhance the coherence and coordination of capacity building efforts related to climate change. The PCCB has established the PCCB Network to support the committee in fulfilling its mission. Therefore, through the link in the chat that will be posted, please do sign up and join this PCCB Network to connect with others, with colleagues, peers across sectors and regions. To stay updated with events like this, please also join us on LinkedIn, and the link is provided in the chat. The event will be recorded, and I'm also very happy to see the very active chat, comments and interventions that were made there. So your contribution and participation is very much appreciated, and we would be also very grateful for your feedback as well. We also have a link to a post-event survey that would take you no more than 2 minutes to answer. because your comments and suggestions will be extremely valuable for the upcoming sessions and events. So once again, thank you to the OECD and to all our contributors and participants, and we hope to see you at the next workshop in September. Thank you very much.
Thank you, bye-bye.
Thank you, goodbye.
Thank you so much. Goodbye.
Thank you, goodbye.
Thank you, goodbye.
Thanks, goodbye.
Goodbye, everybody.
Ah, se fue Jens ahora. Ah, justo cuando ya había terminado. Bueno.